The Arizona sun was merciless that afternoon, burning down on the dust-blown desert range. Heat shimmered above the asphalt parking lot, where pickup trucks lined up beside sedans and motorcycles, their owners gathered for a weekend of firepower and camaraderie. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and sun-baked brass. Targets downrange glimmered like silver coins, set up hundreds of yards away. The range was always noisy. Shots cracked like whips, brass clinked against concrete. Conversations competed with the sound of weapons cycling. Most people came here for sport, to test themselves, or to feel the satisfying punch of recoil in their shoulders. They carried AR-15s, hunting rifles, pistols, even the occasional shotgun. But on this day, all of them would remember the quiet woman who walked through the range house door. Emily didn't draw attention at first. She was slender, dressed in jeans, boots scuffed by desert grit, and a faded army jacket that hung loosely from her frame. A ball cap shielded her eyes from the glare. She moved with purpose, but not arrogance. Her steps measured, steady, as if she knew exactly where she was going. When she reached the counter, she looked up at the man in charge. The range officer had the kind of presence that filled a room. Broad-shouldered, sunburnt, his polo stretched across his chest, a whistle dangling from his neck. He'd been doing this job for years, teaching newcomers, correcting bad habits, keeping people safe. He prided himself on spotting who knew what they were doing and who didn't. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, giving her a polite nod. "What can we set you up with today? We've got plenty of rifles available, some good starter platforms." Emily's voice cut through, calm and certain. "I'd like to fire the Barrett .50. The words seemed to hang in the air, louder than the gunfire outside. The officer blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "The Barrett?" he repeated, leaning an elbow on the counter. "Yes," Emily said simply. She didn't smile, didn't fidget. Her tone was steady, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being taken seriously. But the officer couldn't help himself. He chuckled, a low, incredulous laugh that made the people nearby glance over. "Lady, that rifle weighs almost as much as you do. Are you sure that's what you want? It's not exactly a plinking toy." The man next to her, a weekend shooter in sunglasses, grinned. "Better start her on a .22 first, eh?" A few others laughed, shoulders shaking. They'd seen this before. Someone walking in with more confidence than sense, asking for a weapon that could throw them flat on their back. But Emily didn't flush, didn't flinch. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked the officer dead in the eye. "Yes, the Barrett." The officer raised his eyebrows, trying to gauge her. She wasn't big, 5'6", maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. Most people her size hesitated when they fired an AR-15, let alone a .50 caliber rifle. The Barrett M82A1 wasn't just a firearm. It was an icon, a monster of steel and recoil. Nearly 30 pounds, 47 inches long, chambered in .50 BMG, around the length of a man's hand. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to destroy vehicles, tear through walls, and reach targets at ranges most rifles couldn't dream of. He'd seen strong men walk away with bruised shoulders and watering eyes after firing it. And here was this quiet woman asking for it, like she was ordering coffee. "Ever even handled recoil like that?" he asked, half-teasing, half-testing. Emily didn't look away. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. The way she said it stopped him. Not boastful, not defensive. Just matter of fact. Behind her, the chuckles continued. Phones lifted discreetly as people prepared to record what they thought would be the highlight of their day. A small woman knocked backward by a monster rifle. Viral material. They didn't know her. They didn't know why she was here. The officer sighed, leaning back. He'd seen too many hot-headed shooters injure themselves by taking on more than they could handle. But something about her stillness unsettled him. She wasn't cocky. She wasn't grinning for cameras. She was just waiting. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily." He studied her for another long moment. "All right, Emily, I'll get it prepped. But don't say I didn't warn you." As he turned to unlock the case, murmurs rippled through the range house. The Barrett was rarely requested, mostly rented by veterans reliving old memories, or big-framed enthusiasts who wanted to test their limits. Watching someone like her asked for was unusual enough to draw a crowd. Emily stood quietly, hands in her jacket pockets. The laughter, the stares, the whispers, it all washed over her without reaction. She had heard them before, in other forms, in other places. People always underestimated what they didn't understand. Her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper tucked into her jacket pocket. It was worn, edges frayed from being opened, and closed too many times. A list of names. She never showed it to anyone, never explained it. But each name mattered. Each name was a reason she could not afford to doubt herself. The officer returned, hefting the rifle like it was nothing. He laid it on the counter with a grunt, metal gleaming in the fluorescent light. "Here it is, big dog. You sure you want to do this?" Emily's gaze drifted over the weapon-long barrel, thick receiver, heavy bipod folded tight. She had seen it before. She had carried it before. Her muscles remembered the weight even now, though no one here would believe her if she said so. "Unsure," she replied. The officer shook his head but started the paperwork, muttering under his breath about liability and bruised shoulders. Behind her, a small group had gathered, whispering, half excited, half skeptical. They were waiting for entertainment. Emily let her eyes wander to the far end of the range. Targets shimmered in the heat, some as close as 100 yards, others nearly 1,000 away. She remembered different targets, a different desert, the jagged cliffs of a place she hadn't spoken of in years. She blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the Arizona sun and the buzz of idle voices. When the officer finally set the Barrett on its bipod at the shooting lane, the crowd followed like moths to flame. Phones lifted higher, lenses ready. The officer gave Emily one last look, part warning, part curiosity. She stepped forward without hesitation, boots crunching on the gravel floor. No one spoke now. Even the laughter had quieted. They were watching something they didn't yet understand. Emily lowered herself to the bench, her hands brushing against the cool steel of the rifle. It felt both foreign and familiar, like shaking. Hands with an old comrade after years apart. The range officer crossed his arms. "All right. Let's see what you've got." Emily took a slow breath, steady and deliberate. The desert wind tugged at her jacket. The chatter behind her blurred into silence. For the first time since she'd walked in, the smirks began to fade. Something about the way she moved told them this wasn't going to end the way they expected. The Barrett M82A1 wasn't a rifle. It was a declaration. On the shooting bench, its presence dominated the lane like a coiled predator. Nearly 4 feet of matte black steel gleamed under the harsh desert sun. Its fluted barrel stretched long and unforgiving, the massive muzzle brake yawning wide, hungry to spit fire. The bipod dug into the concrete, anchoring it like a beast chained and waiting. Even silent, it radiated power. The officer knew what it could do. He'd seen the after effects of its rounds. Craters in steel targets, vehicles ripped open, silhouettes shattered beyond recognition. The .50 BMG cartridge was infamous, each brass case longer than most people's palms. A bullet heavy enough to punch through half an inch of steel plating. Designed for war, not sport. He crossed his arms and studied Emily again. She looked absurd kneeling beside it, her frame small compared to the rifle's length. The Barrett dwarfed her, its barrel jutting forward like a cannon, while she calmly adjusted her position on the bench. She didn't fuss or fumble. She simply lowered her cheek to the stock with practiced ease. The officer couldn't help himself. "You sure you know what you're doing?" His voice carried, enough for the small crowd behind them to hear. A few chuckled, whispering things like, "Watch this, she's gonna eat dirt and bet she doesn't get past one round." Phones lifted higher, little red record lights blinking. Emily ignored them. Her focus was fixed on the rifle, on the mechanics she remembered too well. She ran her fingers along the receiver, found the charging handle, and pulled it back with one smooth motion. The metallic clack silenced a few laughs. She slid the massive cartridge into place and released the handle, chambering the round. Her movements weren't hesitant, weren't exploratory. They were familiar. The officer frowned. He'd expected awkwardness, a beginner's clumsiness. But she moved like someone who had done this before, perhaps more than once. He leaned slightly closer, watching her hands. There was no tremor, no wasted motion. Her breathing was steady, shoulders squared, every action deliberate. Still, doubt clung to him. He'd seen strong men buckle under the Barrett's recoil, jaws clenching as the blast slammed through their shoulders. This woman looked like she'd be carried off in the wind if she sneezed too hard. He tried again, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "You know, most folks start with the ARS or the bolt actions. That thing's like jumping into a hurricane before you've learned to swim." Emily finally looked up, just for a second. Her eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "I know what it is," she said quietly. Something in her tone unsettled him. Not arrogance, not bravado. Just fact, delivered with the same certainty as if she'd told him the sky was blue. The crowd muttered among themselves, torn between amusement and intrigue. Some wanted to see her fail, the recoil knocking her flat for their entertainment. Others, sensing the shift in her demeanor, leaned forward, curious. There was something unusual here, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The officer sighed, shaking his head. "All right, your shoulder? Don't come crying to me if you can't lift your arm tomorrow." But even as he said it, he was watching her differently now. Emily rested her hands lightly on the grips, feeling the familiar contours of the rifle. It had been years since she'd last held one. But the weight, the balance, the sheer presence of it, it all came flooding back. Memories stirred, unbidden. A scorching mountainside, sweat soaking through her fatigues, a Barrett cradled against her shoulder as radio. Chatter filled her ears. She forced the thought away before it could drag her under. Not here, not yet. Instead, she focused on the present. Downrange, the targets waited. Large steel plates, bright white against the desert backdrop. One sat at 300 yards, another at 500, a third nearly 800 yards away. The Barrett could reach far beyond that, but for today, these were enough. She adjusted her cheek weld, closed one eye, and settled into the scope's reticle. The crosshairs hovered steady, her breathing controlled. Around her, the murmurs swelled. Again, someone whispered, "She looks like she's done this before." Another scoffed, "Yeah, right, she's just posing." The officer didn't laugh this time. He was watching too closely. Her form wasn't perfect, no weekend shooter's was, but it carried a familiarity that he couldn't dismiss. The way she leaned into the rifle, not too stiff, not too loose. The way she exhaled slowly, timing her breaths. It was all too deliberate. Behind her calm exterior, Emily felt the familiar rhythm returning. Breathe, settle, squeeze. Not yank, not slap squeeze. She remembered the first time she'd been taught, the instructor's voice sharp in her ear. Control the rifle. Don't fight it. Make it an extension of you. She had learned well. The officer leaned toward the crowd, muttering, "If she actually hits, I'll eat my hat." It drew a few chuckles, easing the tension. But inside, even he wasn't so sure anymore. Emily's finger brushed the trigger, feather-light. Not yet. She wanted to feel the rifle, the weight of anticipation, the silence before the storm. The desert breeze tugged at her cap, carrying the faint tang of spent gunpowder. Somewhere behind her, someone coughed. Time seemed to stretch. The Barrett loomed, ready to roar, while the woman behind it remained perfectly still. The officer realized something then. This wasn't about curiosity, or showing off, or some reckless dare. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here for herself. Whatever past she carried, whatever story lingered behind those calm eyes, it had brought her to this moment, to this weapon, to this lane under the desert sun. And for the first time that day, he stopped doubting. He just wanted to see what would happen when she pulled the trigger. The Arizona desert shimmered before her eyes, but Emily no longer saw it. The dry wind, the distant clang of steel targets, the murmurs of the crowd, all of it blurred into memory. She was back in another desert, one harsher, heavier with meaning. Afghanistan, Kandahar province. 2012. The air there was different, hotter, grittier, charged with tension, even when no shots were fired. Dust clung to everything. Weapons, uniforms, lungs. The mountains cut sharp lines against the horizon, jagged and merciless, as if nature itself had built fortresses for an invisible enemy. Emily had been young then, only 23, still carrying the raw edges of training. She'd shipped out with adrenaline in her veins and determination in her heart, eager to prove herself. The army had stripped her down, rebuilt her, taught her discipline and skill. But no manual, no drill sergeant's barked orders could fully prepare her for the reality of a combat zone. The day it happened, the sun was punishing. She and her unit had been ordered to provide overwatch along a ridge that overlooked a convoy route. Insurgent activity had spiked in the area. IEDs, ambushes, suspicious vehicles, shadowing American supply lines. That stretch of dirt road below was a lifeline, and every convoy rolling through it carried both supplies and the lives of soldiers depending on them. Her sergeant, a broad man with years carved into his face, surveyed the terrain with binoculars. "We've got movement," he muttered, pointing to the far side of the valley. Dust rose in the distance, a vehicle creeping along a side path that led toward the main road. Could be nothing. Could be trouble. The call came down quick. Watch, confirm, be ready. Then the Barrett arrived. 2 soldiers carried it up the slope, grunting under its weight. They laid it down on the ridge like men handling a sacred relic. Emily stared at it, her breath catching. She'd seen the rifle in training photos, heard stories about its range, its destructive power. But seeing it up close in the middle of a mission, it felt larger than life, a weapon forged for moments that mattered. Her sergeant caught her staring. "Ever handled one of these?" Emily shook her head. He narrowed his eyes. "Then you don't get near it unless I say so. This thing isn't a toy. It's for one shot that counts." But fate had other plans. The dust cloud in the valley grew larger, closer. The vehicle wasn't heading toward the civilian villages. It was angling toward the convoy route. "Radio says convoy's 5 mics out," another soldier called, his voice tight. The sergeant swore. He turned to his men. "Get eyes through the glass." They raised scopes, binoculars, rangefinders. Emily did the same, heart pounding. Through the heat haze she saw the truck, old, beat up, its bed covered with a tarp that bulged unnaturally. Her stomach twisted. She'd seen enough training slides to recognize the possibility. Explosives, They're gonna intersect. Someone muttered. Orders? Emily asked, her voice tight. The sergeant didn't answer right away. He was listening to the radio. His jaw locked. The convoy commander's voice was calm but urgent. We've got no alternate route. Advise. Over. Every second stretched long. Finally, the sergeant dropped the binoculars, eyes hard. We take the shot. Disable it before it gets close. The two soldiers who'd hauled the Barrett up looked at each other, then at him. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I'm not confident at this distance. Not with that wind. The sergeant swore again. His gaze swept over the ridge. Then it landed on Emily. You, he said sharply. Emily blinked. Me? You've got steady hands. I've seen your range scores. You're up. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Sergeant, I've never fired. No time. Get behind it, now. Her legs moved before her brain caught up. She dropped beside the rifle, the earth hot beneath her knees. The Barrett loomed, heavy and intimidating. She could feel the eyes of her unit on her, the weight of their doubt pressing in. The sergeant crouched beside her. Listen up. Forget the size. Forget the noise. It's just a rifle. Breathe, squeeze. You don't fight it. You let it roll. With you? Emily swallowed hard, hands trembling as she adjusted the bipod, pressed her cheek against the stock. The scope magnified the world below, crosshairs dancing over the dusty road. The truck was closer now, weaving slightly, engine rattling. Her mouth went dry. The sergeant's voice was steady. Aim for the tire. Disable. Don't detonate. The enormity of it crashed over her. If she missed, the convoy could be ambushed. If she hit wrong, the truck could explode prematurely. Dozens of lives balanced on her ability to control a rifle she'd never fired before. She drew a shaky breath. Steady, steady. The crosshairs hovered over the front tire. She adjusted for the wind, just as she'd been trained. The truck jolted on the uneven road, but she tracked it, her finger tightening on the trigger. For a split second, she was aware of everything. The sweat trickling down her temple, the dust scratching her throat, the radio crackling with voices, the pounding of her own heart. Then she squeezed. The world erupted. The Barrett roared, the recoil slamming back into her shoulder like a sledgehammer. The sound was deafening, echoing through the valley, a thunderclap of pure force. Through the scope, she saw the tire explode. In a burst of rubber and dust, the truck lurched violently, skidding sideways, grinding to a halt at the edge of the road. Impact confirmed, someone shouted. The radio came alive. Convoy clear. Vehicle disabled. Repeat, vehicle disabled. Emily's chest heaved. Her hands still gripped the rifle, the vibration humming through her bones. She blinked, hardly believing what she'd done. Her sergeant exhaled slowly, clapping her shoulder. Damn fine shot. But Emily didn't feel pride. She felt the weight. The truck was stopped, yes, but inside there were men. Enemies, maybe, but human all the same. She didn't know what would happen to them now. She only knew that dozens of American soldiers had rolled past safely because of the shot she'd taken. Her shoulder throbbed where the rifle had slammed into it, but she barely noticed. The Barrett's echo lingered in her chest, heavy and unforgettable. That was the first time she understood the truth of the weapon. Not a toy, not a symbol, but a responsibility. And it was a truth that never left her. The blast still echoed across the mountains when Emily lifted her head from the scope. Her ears rang, the sound rattling in her skull like a struck bell. She blinked against the haze of dust the Barrett's muzzle brake had kicked up, the air, acrid with gunpowder. Below, the truck was stopped cold. Its front tire shredded. The vehicle sat at an awkward angle, half tilted in the ditch beside the road. The driver's door swung open, a figure stumbling out. Through the shimmer of heat, she could see men inside scrambling, waving their arms, caught between panic and indecision. Direct hit. A voice shouted behind her. Another soldier punched. The air. Hell yeah, she nailed it. The sergeant crouched beside her, lowering his binoculars. His jaw tightened, but there was relief in his eyes. Convoy safe. They'll pass through clean. He turned to the radio operator. Confirm. Status. Static crackled, followed by the convoy commander's calm report. Visual on disabled vehicle. Road clear. Proceeding. Over. The ridge exhaled as one. Tension released in a rush, shoulders unclenched. Curses of relief muttered, laughter. Bubbling at the narrow escape. For a brief moment, Emily's unit looked at her differently. The rookie, the one nobody had considered for a heavy rifle, had just taken the shot that mattered. Her sergeant gave her shoulder a firm pat. Good work, soldier. Damn fine shot. But Emily couldn't return his smile. Her heart still hammered in her chest, not with pride, but with something heavier. Through the scope, she could still see the truck, the men inside it. They weren't rushing forward, no. They weren't chasing the convoy. They were stranded, vulnerable, staring up at the ridge where they knew the shot had come from. She wondered if they were afraid. If they were. Angry. If they were human beings who had families waiting in dusty villages, or zealots who'd volunteered for martyrdom. In that moment, she couldn't separate them. All she knew was this. Her bullet had changed the story. Around her, the soldiers celebrated the success. One clapped her on the back hard enough to jolt her forward. First time behind the .50. And you wreck it, huh? That's badass. Emily forced a small nod, but inside, she felt none of the adrenaline-fueled joy they did. Her shoulder throbbed from the recoil, a dull ache spreading into her collarbone, but she barely noticed. What stuck in her mind wasn't the force of the rifle. It was the silence after. Because in that silence, she realized she had just become part of a story she'd carry forever. Her sergeant crouched again, his voice quieter this time. Don't overthink it, specialist. You did what needed to be done. That's all that matters. She wanted to believe him. She wanted the simplicity of that truth, that she had protected the convoy, saved lives. But the image of the men in the truck gnawed at her. The training manuals hadn't prepared her for that the moment after, when the dust settled, and the enemy wasn't a faceless silhouette, but a person standing in the wreckage of her decision. The convoy rumbled past minutes later, armored trucks, rolling safely along the road, engines growling. Soldiers inside gave thumbs-up gestures toward the ridge. They didn't know who had fired. They didn't know her name. They only knew the road was clear because of a shot they hadn't even heard. For them, it was another day's mission completed. For Emily, it was something else entirely. When the Barrett was finally lifted away, she felt her arms go strangely. Light, as if she'd been carrying more than just the rifle. She rubbed her sore shoulder, wincing at the deep bruise already forming. The weight of the weapon lingered, an echo in her muscles. That night, back at the outpost, the mission was filed as a success. Reports would say a potential threat was neutralized. A convoy passed unscathed, 0 friendly casualties. Clean, efficient, victory. But Emily didn't sleep. She lay awake on her cot, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling, listening to the hum of generators and the occasional bark of distant dogs. Her shoulder burned with every breath, but it was her mind that throbbed worse. She kept seeing the truck, the men inside. The moment the tire exploded and their world tilted. The sharp stillness afterward, like the desert itself, was holding its breath. She reminded herself what her sergeant had said. You did what needed to be done. But the weight of it didn't ease. In the days that followed, she noticed how the others looked at her differently. Respect had crept in, unspoken but present. She had fired the Barrett when others hesitated, delivered under pressure. Some even teased her with admiration. "Hey, 50 cal girl, you're buying first round if we ever make it home." Emily forced smiles, nodded at their jokes. But she never joined their laughter. Because she knew what they didn't. That behind every cheer, every congratulation, there was a responsibility she couldn't shrug off. The Barrett wasn't just a rifle. It was a burden. A tool that demanded precision, demanded purpose. And when you pulled its trigger, the echoes stayed with you. She never forgot the way the recoil had slammed her body, not just into the dirt of that ridge, but into a new understanding of herself. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was someone who had made a decision in a split second that altered the course of dozens of lives. Years later, in Arizona, when laughter rippled at her request to fire the Barrett again, that was what returned to her. Not the glory, not the applause of her unit, but the silence that followed the shot, the weight of the lives balanced on. It wasn't about proving herself to the officer, or to the crowd, or even to herself. It was about honoring the truth of what that rifle meant. The Barrett wasn't power. It was responsibility. And Emily carried that responsibility still. The desert sun pressed down harder now, heating the concrete shooting bay until it shimmered. Sweat gathered at the nape of Emily's neck, sliding beneath her collar. But her hands were steady on the Barrett's grips. Her cheek welded to the stock. She had drifted for a moment back to the mountains of Afghanistan, back to that first echoing blast that still haunted her. The weight of it had followed her across years and continents. But here, at this small civilian range outside Phoenix, she was being called to carry it again. Behind her, the murmurs of the crowd swelled. "She's still holding it like she means business," one man whispered. "Or like she's gonna get knocked flat," another chuckled. The officer stood just behind her shoulder, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He wasn't laughing anymore. Something in the way she had handled the rifle, chambered the round, even just settled into the bench, it didn't match the nervous fumbling of a first-timer. It carried the gravity of someone who'd done this before, and that unsettled him. He cleared his throat. "All right. Whenever you're ready." Emily inhaled deeply, the air dry and sharp. She let it fill her lungs, then slowly exhaled, letting her body sink deeper into the rifle. The steel wasn't foreign. It wasn't intimidating. It was heavy, yes, but familiar. Through the scope, the world narrowed. The chatter faded, the heat shimmer blurred. All that existed was the distant steel plate at 500 yards. White paint gleamed under the sun, unmarred, waiting. Her pulse slowed. Breathe. Settle. Squeeze. It was the same mantra that had carried her through the mountains. The same rhythm drilled into her bones years ago. She knew what would happen. The concussion would punch the air from her lungs. The recoil would drive deep into her shoulder. The sound would split the desert open. Around her, the crowd would react, flinching, shouting, maybe cheering. But for her, the moment wouldn't be about noise or spectacle. It would be about control. The officer leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping lower, as if speaking only to her. "You know, most people fire this once and call it good, satisfies the curiosity. But you," he paused, studying her profile. "You look like you're here for something else." Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. If she opened her mouth now, everything she'd kept married the sand. The dust, the broken silence of that Afghan ridge might come spilling out. Instead, she focused on the reticle. She adjusted her grip, nudging the stock tighter into her shoulder pocket. Her left hand steadied the forend. Her trigger finger rested lightly, poised but patient. The world shrank smaller still. Somewhere behind her, a phone buzzed with a notification. Someone coughed. Shoes scuffed. On concrete. But none of it reached her. It was only her, the rifle, and the waiting steel. The first shot was always the hardest. Not because of recoil, not because of aim, but because of everything that came with it. Years of memory pressed on her like unseen hands. The last time she had squeezed a Barrett's trigger, it hadn't been a painted steel plate that shattered. It had been a truck tire on a dusty road, enemy fighters inside, lives spiraling from that single decision. Her throat tightened. She felt the sweat bead along her temples. Her finger inched closer to the breaking point. The officer noticed her hesitation. He tilted his head, his skepticism softening into something else, curiosity, maybe even respect. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't milking attention. She was wrestling with something real. He had seen plenty of people sit behind this gun, grinning for cameras, eager for the adrenaline rush. But this woman, she looked like she was shouldering an invisible weight, along with the rifle. The crowd, restless, began to murmur again. Is she gonna shoot or what? Come on, lady, it's just a trigger pull. Emily closed her eyes for half a breath, just long enough to hear another voice, the sergeant's years ago, calm and steady in her ear. You did what needed to be done. When she opened them again, the steel plate downrange was clear, steady in her scope. She exhaled slowly. The crosshairs held. Her fingers squeezed. The Barrett roared. The blast ripped through the lane, a thunderclap that shook the concrete, then sent a shockwave rolling into the crowd. Phones wobbled, hats lifted from heads. The recoil drove into her shoulder like a battering ram, but she had braced for it. She absorbed the hit, rode it out, and kept the rifle steady. Downrange, the steel plate rang like a church bell, a sharp metallic clang that echoed back across the desert. A fresh crater appeared dead center, smoke curling faintly in the hot air. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, laughter. Some cheered, others cursed in disbelief. Dead center? No way first shot? Holy hell, she smoked it. Emily eased her cheek from the stock, blinking through the haze of gunpowder. The rifle rested heavy but tame against her. She rolled her shoulder, the dull ache spreading familiar and strangely comforting. The officer stared at the plate through, his binoculars silent. Then he lowered them slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something else, respect, maybe even humility. He glanced at Emily. That wasn't luck. She said nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze still fixed downrange. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. For her, the clang of steel had carried more than victory. It had carried echoes. In her mind, for just a flicker, the steel plate had been a truck tire. The desert here had been the desert there, and the cheer of the crowd had been the silent, heavy breath of soldiers on a ridge, waiting to see if they'd survive. She forced herself back into the present. The officer, still holding his binoculars loosely, tilted his head at her. "You've fired one of these before." It wasn't a question. Emily finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady, quiet. "Yeah," she said softly. "I have." The murmur swelled again, the crowd hanging on the words they'd barely heard. Phones tilted closer, cameras hungry. But the officer didn't press her. Not yet. He simply studied her like a puzzle with missing pieces. Emily leaned into the Barrett again, her hands resetting on the grips. She chambered another round with a smooth, practiced motion. The crowd hushed. The officer raised his brows. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The ringing steel still hung in the air when Emily pulled back the charging handle. The brass casing ejected with a metallic clink, bouncing against the concrete before spinning to rest at her feet. She barely glanced at it. Her hands already moved with the smooth certainty of habit, sliding another long cartridge into the chamber. The officer noticed. He had trained hundreds of shooters over the years, watched plenty of folks fight with bolts or fumble magazines. But her? She was on autopilot, her movements crisp, fluid, almost rehearsed. "Not your first dance with the 50, he muttered under his breath. The crowd had grown. More shooters drifted from neighboring lanes, curiosity pulling them toward the thunder they'd heard. A line of cell phones lifted, lenses aimed at Emily like she was some spectacle. A kid in a baseball cap whispered, "Bet she can't do it twice." Emily ignored them. She was already back in position, cheek on the stock, body angled just right. Through the scope, the world was still. The heat waves shimmered, the white steel plate waiting. She exhaled, squeezed. The Barrett thundered again. Dust erupted from the muzzle, rolling in waves. The crowd flinched instinctively. One man cursed, clutching his chest like the blast had stolen his heartbeat. Downrange, the plate sang again. This time, the crater bloomed just inches beside the first. Close enough, the two holes nearly touched. The crowd erupted louder than before. "No way." She stacked it. "What the hell, who is she?" Emily didn't look at them. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She just eased the rifle back, rolled her shoulder, and chambered another round. The officer stepped closer now, his curiosity sharpening into something heavier. He crouched slightly to her level. "I've trained big men who couldn't ride. This rifle the way you just did. You're not just some hobby shooter. So I'll ask straight, where'd you learn that?" Emily's jaw flexed. For a moment, she didn't answer. Her finger rested along the trigger guard, not inside it. The memory threatened again. The Afghan sun, the ridge, the burning truck. She swallowed hard. "Overseas," she said finally, her voice low but steady. The officer's brows knit. "Military?" Emily didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She just shifted back to the scope, her silence answer enough. The crowd didn't hear the words, but they caught the tone. Murmurs spread, speculation buzzing. Like flies. "Overseas? You think she was deployed?" "No way, she's two." "Two what?" Another cut in. Phones tilted closer. Cameras zoomed. They didn't know they were filming something far heavier than a novelty. Emily pulled. The trigger again. The Barrett roared. The plate sang. Another crater marking her precision. By now the steel looked less like a clean target and more like a battlefield scar. 3 shots, all clustered tight. Impossible for a beginner. Impossible for most veterans. The officer exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slowly. He'd doubted her. He'd laughed. But now he felt the sting of that arrogance. Whoever she was, whatever she carried, she had earned that rifle. "All right," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You've done this before. Not just once." Emily's cheek left the stock. Her eyes burned not from the sun, not from sweat, but from the ghosts pressing closer with each round. She saw the faces again, men scattering from the crippled truck, her scope tracking movements she never admitted aloud. She remembered the silence that followed, the way the desert had swallowed every sound but her heartbeat. She blinked hard, forcing the ghosts back. She wasn't in Afghanistan. She was in Arizona, but the rifle didn't let her forget. Her shoulder throbbed now, but she welcomed the pain. Pain reminded her she was still here. Pain anchored her. The officer studied her carefully. "You're not just shooting steel out here, are you?" Emily's lips pressed tight. She wanted to say no, wanted to insist she was just another shooter chasing noise and recoil. But that wasn't true. Every round she fired here carried echoes of the rounds she'd fired there. The crowd, impatient, called out, "Do it again. Go for the 800-yard plate. She's on fire." Emily inhaled, her chest rising. She could feel the weight of all their eyes, all their shallow excitement. To them, This was entertainment. A sideshow. A woman shocking the crowd with a cannon. But to her, this was memory turned tangible. A weapon that didn't just fire it. Remembered. She slid another cartridge into the chamber. The brass gleamed in the sun. This time, her voice slipped out in a whisper before she could stop it. I fired one of these on a mission. The officer froze. The crowd didn't catch the words, but he did. His head tilted, his expression hardening, respectful now. Which mission? He asked quietly. Emily didn't answer yet. She wasn't ready. But the question hung in the hot desert air, heavier than the rifle itself. Her finger found the trigger again. The Barrett roared. The steel sang. And every echo pulled her closer to the truth she'd been avoiding. The Arizona sun sagged lower, casting long, wavering shadows across the range. The steel plates downrange were scarred and cratered, proof of her precision. But the crowd wasn't watching the targets anymore. They were watching her. Emily slid another cartridge into the Barrett. The brass glinted, sharp against the fading light. She hesitated before closing the chamber. The officer's voice cut the silence. You said you fired one of these on a mission. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that made people stop shuffling, stop whispering. Even the crowd sensed the shift, their chatter softening into an uneasy hush. Emily kept her cheek off the stock, her gaze distant. Yeah, she murmured. The officer didn't push immediately. He let the moment breathe, studying her face, the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers lingered on the rifle like it was both anchor and burden. Then quietly, which one? Emily inhaled, chest rising. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her eyes stayed fixed downrange, as though the steel plates might morph into the dusty ridges of another desert. I shouldn't, she whispered. The officer crouched lower, his voice pitched for her alone. You don't owe them anything, but you owe yourself the truth. A long silence stretched. The crowd shifted, restless but riveted. Someone muttered, "What's she talking about?" Another hissed, "Shut up, just listen." Emily exhaled slowly, shoulders sagging. Her grip tightened on the Barrett stock. "It was Afghanistan," she said finally. The word cracked through the air. Sharp as a shot, the officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. He had guessed as much, but hearing her say it was different. Her voice, low and uneven, continued. Convoy patrol. Summer of '09. We were moving supplies down Highway 1. Hot day. Too hot. The kind where the air itself feels like it's boiling. As she spoke, the present dissolved. The crowd faded, the Arizona range blurred, and Emily was back there. The Humvees had rattled forward, armored beasts groaning under the weight of gear and men. Dust hung in the air, clinging to skin, seeping into throats. She had ridden with her squad, helmet heavy, rifle across her lap, eyes scanning every ridge, every patch of road that looked too smooth. The radio crackled with updates, clipped voices betraying tension. The locals had gone scarce that morning. Markets shuttered, children absent from the roadsides. That was always the sign silence before the storm. Emily had felt it in her bones. Something was waiting. They took positions along a ridge as the convoy approached the choke point. She remembered the sweat stinging her eyes, the dry taste of fear mixing with dust. She remembered setting the Barrett's bipod into the dirt, her hands clumsy at first, then steadying as muscle memory took over. The sergeant had leaned in, voice low but firm, eyes sharp. You see anything, you don't hesitate. And then, she'd seen it. A truck, older, beat up, painted dull tan to blend with the dirt, parked awkwardly along the roadside ahead. At first, it looked abandoned, but then movement. A door creaked open, figures inside. Her heart had slammed against her ribs. She knew what it meant. They weren't there by accident. Possible V-beat, someone hissed over comms. Her sergeant's voice cut in, calm but urgent. Range it. Take the shot. Back in Arizona, Emily's voice faltered. She blinked, dragged herself out of the memory long enough to breathe. Her throat was dry. The officer waited, silent, his gaze steady. The crowd leaned forward as one, caught between fascination and unease. This was no longer just a shooting demonstration. This was confession. Emily swallowed hard. I put the crosshairs on the tire. Not the windshield, not the men, just the tire. If I disabled it, maybe they'd run. Maybe the convoy could pass. Her hands trembled faintly on the Barrett. No. Not with fear, but with memory. I squeezed. The rifle kicked. The tire exploded. The truck dropped into the ditch. The Arizona crowd exhaled in unison, like they'd been holding their breath. But Emily wasn't finished. They scrambled out, shouting, armed, confused. A convoy rolled past without a scratch. Her eyes darkened, gaze distant. But I still see them. I don't remember their faces, but I remember the way they moved. Like their world just collapsed in one heartbeat. Her voice wavered, but she forced the words. I saved ours, but I ruined theirs. The crowd was silent now. Phones still recorded, but no one dared speak. The officer studied her, his face unreadable, though something in his eyes softened. War isn't clean, he said finally. You made the call that saved lives. That's not ruin. That's duty. Emily shook her head slightly, her lips pressing tight. Duty doesn't chase you in your dreams. The officer had no answer for that. She looked back to the Barrett, her palm running along the receiver like she was touching something alive. Every time I fire one of these, I hear it again. The blast, the silence after. Doesn't matter if it's a steel plate or a truck. The sound never leaves. A hush blanketed the range. Even the wind seemed to still. The officer straightened. Slowly, addressing the crowd now, though his words were more for her. What you just heard, that's the kind of thing most of us never understand. It's not a show. It's not just noise. It's history carried in someone's bones. Emily's jaw tightened. She slid another round into the chamber, more to steady herself than to shoot again. The weight of the brass in her hand felt like a reminder. Choices made, choices carried. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They didn't egg her on. They just watched, subdued, as if realizing they had stumbled into something sacred, something not meant to be entertainment. The officer's voice softened again. And yet, here you are, still behind it, still steady. Emily's eyes lifted, finally meeting his. They were sharp, wet, unflinching. Because I have to be, she said. If I let it own me, I lose. So I pick it up, I fire it. And I remind myself I'm still in control. The officer nodded slowly, respect in his gaze. And for the first time all day, Emily felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because she had spoken it aloud. The air over the Arizona range hung heavy, still vibrating from the last shot. The steel plates, scarred and cratered, reflected the late afternoon sun, but their gleam was secondary to the story they now carried, Emily's story. The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. His eyes, dark behind sunglasses, held a new respect. No longer was she a woman requesting a rifle for fun. She was a soldier, a sharpshooter, a witness to history carried in the barrel of a rifle. You've told us a bit, he said softly, about Afghanistan, the convoy, the truck, but you haven't named it yet. The mission, the operation, the one that really mattered. Emily's jaw tightened. Naming it meant putting it fully into the world. It meant acknowledging the lives, the fear, the responsibility she had carried for years. The Barrett rested against her shoulder. She wasn't afraid of its recoil anymore. She was afraid of the truth she'd carry once she spoke it. She began, her voice low, hesitant. Her eyes scanned the desert horizon, where heat waves blurred the mountains into distant ghosts. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years pressing down. It was Operation Swift Strike, Helmand Province. Summer of 2010. The officer's brows lifted. That's the one? Emily nodded, sliding another cartridge into the chamber. As if to steady herself, her fingers lingered on the brass, the same heavy metal she'd handled in war zones half a world away. Yes, Swift Strike, convoy escort. Insurgent threats were high that day. The road was a trap waiting to happen. The crowd murmured, recognizing the gravity of the name, even if they didn't know the details. Phones were still out, cameras raised, but their lenses no longer felt intrusive. They were witnesses now, but silent, reverent witnesses. Emily exhaled. Slowly, memories flooding back like an unrelenting tide. The convoy had been 5 vehicles long, carrying everything from food supplies to medical kits. They had relied on her eyes and her aim to ensure no one stepped on an IED. No vehicle was ambushed. The Barrett had been her tool, her lifeline. But it was more than that. It had been a responsibility she couldn't afford to shirk. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. The truck appeared on the ridge road. I was told to wait, to observe. But I saw the pattern, the movement. I knew if I didn't act, the convoy would be vulnerable. I had one chance. One shot, and I took it. She lowered the rifle, eyes sweeping over the plate, now riddled with bullet scars. Imagining the truck, the insurgents scrambling, the convoy rolling past safely. Her shoulder throbbed faintly, a dull echo of the recoil, but it reminded her that she was still alive, still capable, still responsible. The officer exhaled slowly. You did exactly what needed to be done. Emily shook her head, barely audible. It's not about what needed to be done. It's about what happens afterward. You make the shot, you save lives, and yet the weight never leaves you. I still see them. I don't know who they were, but I know the moment I pulled the trigger, their world changed. The crowd was silent, the weight of her words pressing down like the desert sun. Phones lowered slowly, whispers vanished, and the hum of the wind seemed louder than ever. One man, younger than most, finally broke the quiet. That's insane. You were just a kid. Emily's eyes flicked to him. I was 23, and I had no choice. The rifle wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving myself. It was about responsibility. About understanding that a single moment can decide lives, and you have to bear that burden. Her gaze swept back to the Barrett. The steel wasn't a trophy. It wasn't entertainment. It was memory made tangible. It held the echo of lives saved and the shadow of lives disrupted. The officer nodded slowly, finally understanding the layers he had missed. I doubted you at first, laughed at your request, but now, I see. Emily didn't respond immediately. She felt the range, the sun, the lingering heat of spent brass in her hands, and the silent crowd. Her body was tense, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She had faced the recoil, the shot, and the truth. Then she did something she hadn't in years. She smiled, faintly, quietly. Not out of pride, but because she had spoken her truth. Because the rifle, heavy and unyielding, had carried her not just through a desert in Afghanistan, but through the shadows of memory that haunted her every aim. The officer stepped back slightly, motioning toward the crowd. Everyone, I think. We just witnessed something more than marksmanship. We witnessed history. We witnessed responsibility. Emily's eyes lingered on the distant plates, now nothing more than target markers. She eased the rifle into the rack, feeling the familiar. ache in her shoulder but welcoming it. Each scar left by her rounds told a story. And today, the story was no longer just hers. It belonged, in some measure, to everyone who had watched, who had listened, and who had finally understood. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with reverence rather than amusement. Phones captured images and videos. Yes, but now they were recording a story of courage, of skill, of accountability. The officer finally spoke to her again, quieter, almost gently. You carried it well. All of it. The rifle, the mission, everything. You've earned more than respect. You've earned understanding. Emily nodded. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. She had laid the truth bare, named the mission, shared the weight she had carried. In silence for years, the Barrett rested heavy at the edge of the bench, a tool, a burden, a memory. And for the first time since that ridge in Helmand province, she felt a sense of closure, not complete, not perfect, but enough to let her shoulders relax, enough to breathe without the shadow of that first shot pressing against her chest. The desert around them seemed to soften, the sun dipping lower, casting long amber streaks across the range. The echoes of her past lingered, yes, but they no longer controlled her. She had faced them, spoken them, and survived. The officer looked at her once more, and in his eyes, Emily saw acknowledgement, understanding, and quiet awe. She had not just fired a rifle. She had carried history through its barrel, and she had survived. Emily turned to the crowd, scanning the faces that had watched her story unfold. There were young faces, old faces, men and women, but all were quiet now, absorbing the weight of what had been shared. And in that silence, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not triumph, not glory, not applause, just peace. The Barrett rested beside her, heavy, scarred, and alive with memory. And for the first time in a long while, she let it be enough.